What we want instead, if we have the pelvis here during the drive phase, what we want is to think about rotating the pelvis down into landing in a plane that matches what we want our torso rotation to be and where we want our arm slot to be. Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here with Tread Athletics, and today this is episode number 2 of our Q&A podcast. So got a lot of good feedback on the last podcast. We got a ton of question submissions to go through today. We're going to try out something a little bit different. We're going to try to shorten up the length of these episodes, maybe cover 15 or 20 questions instead of 30 or 40 questions, and try to keep this under half an hour if we can. So say that now, we'll see how it actually goes, but I'm going to try to keep these a little bit more concise and break them up moving forward so that you guys can digest them a little bit easier. That being said, I'm just going to kind of roll through these one at a time. I'm going to put these questions up on the screen as I go through them. And again, if you guys have any further submissions after this episode, let me know down in the comments below. So with that being said, let's get to it. The first question comes from Logan Layton. Do you believe long toss is something everyone should do, or is it dependent on the individual? I believe I touched on this in the last episode, but long toss is definitely individual specific. So I love long toss. I view long toss as a drill. It's not necessarily an arm strengthening exercise. Any throwing is going to help acclimate your arm to the specific stresses of throwing. So I don't really see it as arm strengthening, but it's a drill that gives you immediate feedback. It's a drill that is often cued where you're trying to work on the overall flow and rhythm of the throw and move out slowly and work on the sequencing of everything. And then as you come back in, you're coming down on a line, pulling down, and working to transfer everything to more of a pitching specific angle. So I like all of these different facets that go into long toss for most pitchers. It's something we use with probably 75 or 80% of our guys. That being said, at the end of the day, it's a matter of is any drill that we prescribe a guy, including long toss, getting the desired effect in their mechanics, in their sequencing, in their velocity, in their arm health, in their arm recovery. So that's the question we ask at the end of the day. Guys who long toss typically long toss doesn't specifically work as well for guys who are sinker ballers, first off, because long toss reinforces or it encourages higher backspin and higher spin efficiency. In other words, when you get behind the ball really well, you get a high spin rate, that ball carries further. If you maybe cut the ball a little bit or you throw it with some sink, it doesn't travel as far. And so that's immediate feedback throw to throw that, hey, that throw wasn't as good as the last throw. Well, maybe it actually was a good throw. It just had a high degree of sink. So for a sinker baller, it doesn't always make sense to spend a ton of time working on something that's encouraging them to get a different type of spin or different hand position or different spin rate than what they're actually what they need to be able to rely on in games. So sinker ballers doesn't always work that well for. Low arm slot guys, it doesn't always work well either, typically because low arm slot guys have sink or a ton of run, and long toss encourages, when you get out to 300 plus feet, you're really trying to get that throw in a pretty narrow lane. And so if you have a ton of arm side run, that ball is going to end up 30, 40, 50 feet to arm side when you get out that far. So low arm slot guys, and then especially submarine guys, I think everyone's pretty familiar with that. Submarine guys, it really doesn't work. You really can't throw extreme distances from a lower arm slot. I use Chris Sale as an example of this. He's a guy I've watched firsthand a number of times how he warms up, how he prepares for the games, and he's a guy who gets out to maybe 90, 120 feet, and then as soon as he gets in the game, he's chucking upper 90s. So it's hard to argue with the success that guys like that have. It's hard to say that long toss is 100% necessary for everybody, because it's not. And the hardest I've ever thrown in my career, I wasn't long tossing at all. And it also wasn't the time at which I felt like I could throw the furthest. The time at which I could throw the furthest, which was maybe 380 feet out of a slide step, I was 90, 92 off the mound. And then when I've been 96, 98 off the mound, I wasn't long tossing, but I would be shocked if I could have thrown over 320, 330 at that particular point in time. So there is a little bit of specificity involved with long toss and involved with the transfer of long toss. So again, it's dependent on every individual. I will try it with almost every normal arm slot, overhand, three-quarter guy who doesn't have some crazy movement or sink or anything like that going on. But from there, it's not just always going to be the same. We're adjusting it based on if it's working, if their numbers are going up, if they're recovering from it, how they're feeling. And then also we should probably mention long toss doesn't mean going out to max distance every single day. a lot of our days with long toss, it's going out to comfort. It's just working out on a loose arc. So some guys think long toss every day, it has to be max effort. You definitely need to, regardless of whether you're long tossing or not, just be aware of the concept of auto-regulation and how much is too much. And so often we just end up going a little overboard with the volume and intensity side of things and don't actually give our arms time to recover. So I would just be aware of that with long toss or with any sort of velocity training. A lot of the effect and benefit of long toss or any of these drills is on the sequencing and the patterning and being able to transfer energy efficiently. It's not necessarily on the intensity of the throw. You can gain velocity by throwing at 60 or 70% if you're working on the flow and the movement and the sequencing. You don't have to be throwing 100% to actually be getting a velocity benefit every single day. So good question from Logan. Next question, also a long toss question. Grant Bradley, 33, asks, do you guys ever assess long toss mechanics? So there are some differences between long toss and mound mechanics, obviously. So we are going to be looking for clues in their long toss mechanics, but specifically if there's some sort of disconnect between their long toss distances and their mound velo. So that's not necessarily the first place we'll go, but if we have a guy who, I have a guy right now, he's 82, 85 off the mound, but he's 330, 340, 350 in long toss. So if you have a guy where there's a disconnect in that regard, or maybe he's throwing harder off the mound, but he's only long tossing 250, if there's some sort of massive disconnect, then we need to dig a little bit deeper and figure out what is he doing maybe mechanically better in long toss that he's not quite transferring off the mound. Is it his footwork? Is it his hip-shoulder separation? Is he relaxing his back hip into landing better? Is he getting better layback? Like what is it about the long toss to the mound mechanics? So we'll dive deeper and really analyze the long toss mechanics if it seems to be a disconnect with their mound velo and mound mechanics. All right, next question comes from Hanber. I'm going to mess that name up, so we'll just put that up on the screen. If one has both excellent internal and external hip rotation, which lower half drive mechanism is preferred? So I've written about this before. I'm sure a lot of you guys have read that article. I'll link that in the description if you haven't. The answer is it really depends on what gives you the best objective results at a given intensity. So one easy way to tell, and for those of you who aren't aware, it's basically we're talking about the back leg position during the drive phase of the throw. Are you holding more of a vertical shin where that knee is straight up and down, that hip is held in abduction, external rotation, or is that knee starting to come forward and drive down to the ground early with that back foot turning in a little bit? And so that's dependent a little bit on your hip anatomy in many cases, but like he's saying, if you have good internal and external, you could throw either way. Then one easy way to tell is essentially go try both ways. What you can do is blind velo testing at a certain intensity. So maybe 75% intensity, throw 5 or 10 one way, throw 5 or 10 the other way, have somebody radar gun those throws, but don't tell you the numbers until afterwards. And a lot of times you'll see that one is 3 or 5 miles an hour lower than the other, and that essentially is your answer right there. That's what your body prefers and how it prefers to transfer energy in most cases. Yes, if you've thrown one way for a long period of time, it's possible that you're just not comfortable throwing the other way and that it could improve with practice, but typically you'll see a pretty drastic difference between one or the other, and you can kind of use that to guide your mechanical patterns. And that works for, I mean, I'm using this for the hip internal external question, but that works for any slight variation in mechanics that you're kind of tinkering and mulling over in your head. If you have two different hand positions or two slightly different arm actions or arm swings that you're kind of playing around with, it's very easy to do a 5 to 10 rep split test at a given intensity and see which one tends to give you better numbers. So good question. D Jacob 75, he asks, how do you fix / work on poor front leg stabilization? We're probably going to make a much more detailed video about this in the future, so I'll just give a couple of thoughts right now. Let me get up to demonstrate this. So a lot of you guys are probably familiar with my philosophy on front leg mechanics, but essentially the front leg and its actions are a result of what the pelvis is doing. So the front leg doesn't slam and extend from a push from the quad. That's not actually how we get that paw back mechanism. The front leg is a slave to what the pelvis is doing. So if I move my pelvis, if I rotate my pelvis straight this way, you can see that the front leg wants to extend because this front part of my pelvis is pulling this femur backwards, and that's pulling that front leg into extension. So this is an example of pure transverse rotation of the pelvis. That's not exactly what we want as throwers, because that has a tendency to bow that knee out towards glove side and also take that weight on the front foot out towards glove side as well. So that's not necessarily as stable of a position to follow through in, although you can see that it does pull that femur and pull that front leg into extension. What we want instead, if we have the pelvis here during the drive phase, what we want is to think about rotating the pelvis down into landing in a plane that matches what we want our torso rotation to be and where we want our arm slot to be. So if we're thinking about a standard 3/4 arm slot, you want to think about the pelvis rotating down into landing, and that's also going to extend the front leg, but now it's in a plane that links up with the torso, up the chain, and links up with our arm slot. So this is the tornado of energy effect that we talk about, which starts there, and then it winds its way up the chain, winds its way into the arm, and into ball release. So front leg mechanics, that's basically it. If we can get good sequencing from the pelvis to the shoulders, if we can get that pelvis to rotate down into landing like that while holding the shoulders back, then we're in a really good spot to brace from, and everything paws back, and you don't get this bowing out effect on the front knee and front foot. When you don't have that, when you just kind of like slam into landing here and everything doesn't separate, then you start getting really low level patterns here. So that's an extremely important piece of the puzzle. It's not just rotating down into landing, it's doing that while you hold the shoulders back. If everything comes together and you end up here, you're still not going to have a good front leg, because the next move is going to be here as a result of that. So rotating down while holding the torso back. That's how you lead to a good front leg brace. You get the paw back mechanism, and it's all happening as a result of the pelvis and the torso and the relationship between the two into landing. All right, the next question, it's actually a series of questions. We got a lot of submissions about the back leg, how to drive the back knee down, how to not overextend or push off the back leg. So I'm just going to read through those and address those one at a time, and just try to get through this slide. So this seems to be a hot topic right now. We're definitely going to make a more in-depth specific video about this topic in the future, just like we will for the front leg. But let's just get into some of these questions right now. So C. Birchfield 5 asks, is not triple extending simply a Q issue, or does it require strength and mobility as well? So just to recap for a lot of you guys who aren't familiar, triple extending, basically the idea, as most of the time it's taught, is that it's extension of the hip, knee, and ankle. And so it's thinking about pushing and going into full extension at all three joints into landing. Just like an Olympic lift, you'd reach full extension, or in sprinting, you'd reach full hip, knee, and ankle extension. So the thought is that that's what's happening in pitching, and that we should be reaching full extension of the back leg. What actually happens in hard throwers is not at all like that. Instead, you see guys that ride their glute center of mass, and then they drive the pelvis like we just talked about, and that pelvis rotation drives the knee down, and so you get this corkscrewing effect of the knee down into landing. Look up any 100-mile-an-hour thrower pretty much ever, and that's what you're going to see. You're not going to see a violent pushing and overextending into landing. When you get this pushing and overextending, it's very hard to internally rotate effectively from this position, because your femur is already in this fully extended position. So you lose out on your ability to actually segment your pelvis from your upper half when you get all the way out here. So that's essentially what he's talking about. He's asking, in this particular case, is that a strength or mobility issue? So if somebody's basically pushing and lunging off this way, and they can't stay in their back leg, whether they're more vertical shin or they're more here, they can't stay in that back leg and drive it down, is that mobility or strength? It tends to be mobility or a cueing patterning issue. It's not as much a strength issue. I mean, you see little leaguers that can do it right, little leaguers that screw it up, but athletes that have zero strength base at all, a lot of times do it right if they've learned the pattern properly. and they do have good mobility. So it tends to not be a strength issue. But mobility-wise, what are we looking at? What tends to be a factor there? Biggest thing I would say is thoracic rotation. So to be able to rotate the pelvis and keep the shoulders back, you need to have good thoracic rotation arm side. So that's one thing. So let's work down the chain from here. The other thing, to be able to ride the hips forward, ride the center forward while staying into your glute and heel, you need to have good mobility through your adductors. So you need to be really clean all the way through your groin, through your high hamstrings, through your hip internal rotators. This whole area up here, if you go into like a lateral lunge and you really sit deep, you need to be able to, you're going to be putting this entire chain on stretch as you drive down the mound properly. So that all needs to be very clean. That's a very common area that guys are kind of stuck in, and so they have a hard time staying in their backside, and lunging kind of becomes the default movement for them. And then working a little bit further down the chain, we also, as we go into hip rotation, and we can slow that down, zoom in on my foot here. We slow it down, what's actually happening. There needs to be tibial internal rotation. So the tibia actually moves as well. Our shin bone needs to be able to move, and our foot needs to be able to evert. So our foot needs to be able to do that. So that helps get that last little bit of rotation and stay into the rubber as long as possible before that foot finally turns over. So we slow that down. Pelvis rotates down. You can see the back knee wants to corkscrew down to the ground. That front leg wants to extend. And what's happening at the foot? The foot's everting, tibia is internally rotating, and then it does finally turn over, and you'll get into ball release. In full speed, it just looks very quick, and you just see that back foot turn over. But if you watch somebody like Giordano Ventura, who does this extremely well, Nate Pearson is a guy who does it extremely well. You watch him at landing, and you see that back knee corkscrewing down to the ground, hips open, and you see that back foot in this extremely kind of bent over, everted position going into landing. So I'll put those two guys up on the screen as well for you guys to watch. Let's get to the next back leg question. Hunter Edwards asks, what do you mean by relax the back hip into rotation? And then we also have a question about, can you explain Trevor Bauer mentioning driving the back knee down? So we'll talk about both of those things. So first, Trevor Bauer, great post. I'll link to that here as well. Created a lot of talk in kind of the pitching Twitter world because of this, because it is kind of going against this whole triple extension notion and showing showing a very high level lower half pattern and showing a completely different before and after of Clevenger between the two clips and between low 90s and upper 90s. So pretty stark difference. I don't necessarily love the cue of driving the back knee down, simply because while it's accurate, you do want to see the back knee corkscrewing down to the ground, and that is what's happening. It shouldn't necessarily be the cue in and of itself, because you're not getting that motion from just internally rotating the hip. The hip is not driving that motion. The pelvis is driving the motion, and the hip is following suit. So because the pelvis drives, the hip follows, and you start to get that action of the back leg corkscrewing down into landing. If you just think drive the knee down to landing, then you get guys that go into landing and they just think about driving that knee down to the ground, which doesn't actually generate or transfer any power. So that's what he's talking about. Obviously they were working on something that worked. I'm sure they were getting the right effect when they actually went through the training and the cueing, but that's what he's talking about, is not pushing off trying to triple extend, but instead driving the pelvis and using that to drive the knee down as a byproduct of rotating the pelvis properly. Relax the back hip into rotation. So this is a cue that I've used myself. It's worked for a number of guys that were muscling up and just kind of didn't know how to transfer energy properly, so they were lunging and jumping. So when you rotate your pelvis, it's not like a violent, you shouldn't be trying to violently just yank your pelvis through. That's not how hard throwers actually do it. It's more of relaxing the pelvis into rotation underneath your torso. So if your torso's up here and stacked, it's more relaxing the pelvis into that position, into landing, and that's how you kind of feel this wave of energy through your body like that. So thing kind of relax and rotate underneath your torso helps sequence that pelvis underneath it without muscling up and without necessarily trying to think about snapping your hips. If you're just trying to violently snap your hips underneath your torso, that's not a pattern that you can adequately or efficiently transfer up the chain. That's a good way to just kind of torque on your lumbar spine and create issues. So just like any hitter, it's a smooth transfer of energy from the back hip. It's not just violently snapping the hips underneath you. That's basically what relax the back hip into rotation means. All right, next couple back leg questions that we have. Does depth while sitting into the back leg have any correlation to velocity? Cue to stop back leg jumping. We already talked about that, so I'm gonna skip that one. And then ideas for pitchers to hold their hinge better during back hip load / drive and not extending early. Now we've kind of touched on that, but I have another idea here I'll share as well. So let's first talk about the depth in the back hip during the drive phase. So this is something that takes a little bit of trial and error. It is going to be individual specific. It's going to be based on your femur to your tibia to your torso length. But essentially, rule of thumb is if you just jumped off a box and you had to land on one foot, what angle would you land on? So I just jumped off and had to land. Where would I land? That's about where your hinge should be. It's the most stable, efficient position you can support load through your system. So something like that for me. Okay, you wouldn't land back here. You wouldn't land completely bent over down here. So something where you can feel that back glute loaded up and you feel like you could support some weight. If somebody dumped 200 pounds on your back, you could support that. You could support a bar here. That's a stable position. This really isn't a stable position. This is completely held up by my quad. This is almost like a sissy squat position back here. And then this isn't nearly as repeatable as well. That's gonna take way too much energy to hold that moving down the mountain. So something basically like a quarter squat position, something you could really hold and feel stable, where you can feel your glute loading up. Some athletes really have a hard time feeling the glute actually load or activate. These tend to be hamstring or quad dominant athletes that just don't have good glute development, don't have good mind-muscle connection or proprioception with their hip muscles. So one way to feel the glute actually load up, if you've never really felt that feeling, is so your glute is a hip extensor and external rotator. So we can kind of wind into that tissue and get you to feel it by doing the opposite, which is hip flexion and internal rotation. So what that looks like, you can basically, if I'm working on my back leg, which is my left leg, I can wind up the opposite direction, like I'm doing a chop, and I'm gonna wind into hip flexion and hip internal rotation until I feel that glute load up. So heel in the ground, and I'm trying to laterally get into my glute right here. So that's a way to really feel the glute load up if you've never felt the connection there. It's just feeling it right there. You can do it, kind of put your eyes where the target would be, feel the glute. Feel the glute. That's essentially what you should feel as you begin the drive phase. We talk about the 3 different phases of the lower half. There's that initial drift or shifting of your center of mass. There's the drive phase, the hinge or drive or whatever you want to call it phase. Then there's that relax into rotation phase where you go from that drive and you relax open into landing and segment. For the hinge / drive phase, whatever you want to call it, you need to be able to find the glute, find the heel, and maintain that as you drive towards the target. So if you have a shift, as you come out of that shift, you should be able to find the glute, ride your center, and then as you get into landing, back hip relaxes into rotation, and everything unwinds from there. So that's the answer to the first question of the depth while sitting. The second question, which is, again, ideas for pitchers to hold their hinge better. It's being able to find the glute first. So before you worry about the drift or that initial shift, one drill that I really like, that I'll link to the tweet that originally I saw this in, but a drill I really like just to work on that, isolate that, is just come up, find your hinge, and then think about riding your center. So not pushing off and also not reaching with the front hip, but riding our center of mass forward while maintaining contact with the glute contact with the heel. So find the hinge, ride. Find the hinge, ride. Find the hinge, ride. So I really like that simple drill, something you can do as part of your warm-up every day for just feeling that initial drive phase and feeling what should happen between the first phase and the third phase of a lower half. Between the weight shift and between the rotation, that's essentially what should happen. So that's a really low load, low level thing you could do every single day just to feel that initial position, feel that find the glute, and then ride the center. Those are the two cues that I would really think about. And then the core velocity belt as a tool, that's something that you should look into, play around with, as far as increasing the hip proprioception, and just as far as being able to help encourage some of these positions and feels in your drive phase. I think that's valuable as well if you haven't looked into it already. All right, next question that we'll get into comes from Just Medlin. He said, if you had to pick one thing about nutrition, what's the biggest thing to focus on? So a little bit of change of pace here. Obviously, a lot of you guys are getting into the off season, and nutrition is going to play a big role in whether you put on 20 or 25 pounds or you kind of spin your wheels like a lot of guys do and don't really make a ton of progress this off season. So by far the biggest thing when it comes to nutrition is caloric balance. This is something that if you've read my ebook, I go through this in extreme detail in terms of what I call the nutritional hierarchy of importance, or my version of the nutritional pyramid in terms of what are the actual most important things and what are the least important things, and putting those in a hierarchy of importance so we know what we should focus on and what doesn't really matter as much. So for example, supplementation, that's the very last thing on the pyramid. That's maybe 1 to 5% of the potential results you're going to get from your nutrition plan. But caloric balance, that's the majority of it. That's 70–80% of whether or not you're going to make progress or not. Just caloric balance, just essentially if you're eating more calories than you're burning. That's really the most important thing. If you did nothing else but track your calories and track your body weight, so track your inputs and your outputs, if what you're doing is working, so that you can adjust your calories up or down depending on how your body weight is being affected. If you did nothing else except that, you're going to get most of the benefit from your nutrition program. From there, the next logical thing to do is track the actual composition of those calories. So protein, fat, and carbohydrates, the proportions of those. From there it comes down to specific food selection. You know, are you getting that from junk food, or are you getting that from protein powder? Like, where are you getting your carbohydrate, carbs, and protein, carbohydrate, fat, and protein sources from? You know, meal timing, meal frequency, how many times a day you eat, and exactly how you space out those meals becomes less important. And then again, supplementation is very, very low on the priority list. Like, what brand of creatine you're taking has almost no importance when it comes to, are you going to have an effective off season? Are you going to make gains or not? And yet that's one of the more common questions we get, not, hey, how do I track my calories? Like, that's just something you should be doing unless you're already completely on track. But if that was the case, you probably wouldn't be watching this video. So you should really be tracking your calories, and from there tracking your macronutrients, the breakdown of those calories, if nothing else. Hando408 asks, what is the best way to ball on a budget nutrition-wise when traveling on the road? I'll link in the description to a bulking on a budget article that I wrote last year. But essentially, go to the grocery store, don't eat out as much. Go to the grocery store and stock up on high-calorie snacks. This doesn't really mean protein bars. I mean, protein bars are $2 or $3 a bar. That's not the most effective way to get your calories in. Just talking, have a loaf of bread with you at all times. Have a jumbo jar of natural peanut butter with you at all times. Have a 5-pound bag of trail mix with you. Have a 12-pack box of granola bars with you. I mean, I would essentially just have a duffel bag of snacks with you on the road. You should have plenty of food, plenty of calories, non-perishable calories. So there's never an excuse when you're on the team bus or in the dugout. There's never an excuse not to get that 500-calorie snack in between meals when you need it. Because ultimately, if you're a guy who's going to need 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day to gain weight, you're really going to have a hard time getting that in just your three main meals of the day. You're going to have to use your snacks to kind of fill in the gaps. So it becomes very important just to have access to that food at all times. But yeah, those are kind of the basics to fill in the gaps. Again, the snacks are way more about just hitting high calories from healthy fat and carb sources. rather than necessarily getting, your veggies or lean protein in. That's more for the main meals of the day, and then your snacks are kind of just calorie fillers to make sure you can hit that overall calorie and macro numbers that you have for yourself. Josh Richardson 2019 asks, how do you develop the habit of being a big eater? I get in my calories / macronutrients, but I struggle to eat a lot. So it definitely is a habit. It's something you have to work on. But the biggest thing, if you're struggling and you feel like you're force feeding yourself, there is definitely a time for force feeding yourself, and there are guys that really do need 5,000 plus calories a day, and there's no way around it. You're gonna have to eat a lot of food, and it's gonna suck. But the vast majority of guys can minimize how much it sucks and minimize the force feeding by basically doing two things, which is one, extending the feeding window as long as possible, which basically means eating a big breakfast when you wake up and having some sort of big snack fairly close to bed. So if you're up from, let's say, 7 a.m. till 10 p.m., you basically extended that feeding window for whatever that is, 15 hours, instead of waiting till noon to eat that first meal. And then you've only got, let's say, 10 hours to actually get those 5,000 calories in. So just by expanding the window, you make it a lot more manageable. And the second thing is the caloric density of the foods that you're eating. So, basically switching out lower fat dairy for higher fat dairy, full fat cheese, full fat, whole milk, things like that make it a lot easier to get your calories in. Full fat meat, so instead of chicken breasts and tuna fish, chicken thighs, steak, 15 ground beef, pork, things that are a little bit higher calorie for the same exact volume of food that you already would be eating, just taking that pound of chicken breast and turning at 440 calories and turning that into a pound of steak at 750 calories. Taking that 40 calorie slice of bread and turning it into the 120 calorie slice of bread that they sell in the exact same aisle for the exact same price. Taking the 80 calorie glass of milk and making that a 200 calorie glass of milk. Doing that just makes it a lot easier to take the same volume of food that you already would be eating, just about no matter what your body composition goal was, and just upping the calories. You can crank the calories way up if everything you're eating you apply that concept to. Kirk R9 asks, what are the effects of excessive alcohol consumption for performance the following day? So, I haven't read all of the literature on alcohol and performance, so I'm not going to pretend that I have all the answers here. That being said, what I have read, essentially if it's 1 to 2 or 3 drinks, a very negligible effect on performance if your sleep patterns stay relatively constant. So if you get to bed normal hour and you're not also dealing with sleep deprivation, dehydration, all those other confounding factors on top of that, it's relatively minimal. There's almost an immeasurable effect on your testosterone levels. But when it comes to excessive alcohol consumption, there is a very noticeable acute drop in testosterone. Obviously, we can all take a more practical look at it and just think anecdotally to a time when we maybe drank 5, 6, however many drinks you can think of that you had, and how you felt the next day, how your performance suffered, maybe in a morning lift or maybe a morning bullpen. In my opinion, more of it is from the dehydration and the sleep disruption than it is from the actual alcohol itself. So it's waking up feeling super dehydrated. That's much of what a hangover is dehydration, and it's basically going to bed later. So me personally, I don't drink much at all, but if I go to bed at 2 or 3 a.m. and I wake up the next day, I feel as though I basically feel the same as if I were to do a night like that. So a lot of it is just going to bed way past normal hours and screwing up your circadian rhythm and being dehydrated. So essentially, I mean, you already know this. You guys all already know this, but I would really keep that to a minimum. Keep that into the off season. Maybe if you're a college kid of age, keep that to 1 day a week and 2 or 3 drinks. It really isn't going to do you any favors in season, and it's only going to disrupt your sleep, give you worse quality sleep, and potentially to dehydration, and probably raise injury risk as well if you are doing some sort of heavy lifting or bullpen the very next morning. So just use common sense there. We're going to stop there for this episode. We have a bunch more questions we're going to answer in the next episode. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this one, and definitely stay tuned for episode 3, which is going to be coming out soon as well. Again, thanks guys for watching. My goal with this whole series is to give you guys as much value as possible and really just interact and have a way to directly connect with you guys about what you guys are curious about. So cool episode. I know there's a lot of questions about the back leg. I'm sure there's going to be a different theme for the next episode, but thanks again for submitting your questions. Myself and our team, we're open for anytime you guys want to reach out or email us specifically and privately for something a little bit more directly for your situation. Definitely feel free to reach out to us, contact@treadathletics.com. If you're not following us on Twitter @treadathletics or Instagram @tread_athletics, make sure to do that as well. Thanks again, guys.